It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, it didn't take long for President-elect Donald Trump to start naming his cabinet. Needless to say, these are remarkable choices on many levels. And in terms of the selection of Matt Gaetz, it's almost like he's testing his Republican majority very early on with a very difficult cabinet choice. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess it's not surprising that it's a transition like no other. They don't seem to actually be giving a lot of consideration to a number of people and quietly talking to the leadership in Congress or the Senate. They just go with the announcement. I don't know whether it's dinner discussions at Mar-a-Lago that is a determinative point of action or the process, but it's certainly nothing like we've seen. Congressman, now former Congressman Matt Gaetz, is in my view a reach way too far. And I think tactically, Donald Trump has misplayed his hand. Clearly, they had this notion that they could get the senators, Republican senators, in contention for the leadership in the Senate to all agree to recess appointments. Now, recess appointments, these are appointments made by a president when the Senate is not in session and is in recess. That's been going on for a long time. I think Reagan may have made a couple hundred of these. But over time, that's been restricted. And in fact, ironically, it was Republican senators that reacted so adversely in 2012 when President Barack Obama, in a recess appointment, placed people on the National Labor Relations Board. Who led the outcry? Mitch McConnell, John Cornyn, saying this was irresponsible. The Senate had a vital role. And by the way, I agree with that. This is the question of the Constitution and a branch of our government that has a very important role, and that is to review the backgrounds and the qualifications of people offered up by the president for these appointed positions. And the Attorney General position is certainly one of the most important. And so to choose a congressman who literally resigned, he ran for re-election, he won re-election, and 8 days later he resigns to avoid the release of a report by the House of Representatives for various transgressions that he's allegedly engaged in. It just, it's beyond the pale. And it really does cause me to wonder whether the highly regarded Susie Wiles as chief of staff is really able to, keep control of anything. I don't think that the recess appointment process is going to actually work for Trump. I think this appointment will cause Republican senators and certainly all Democratic senators to just say, enough is enough. By the way, Trump has to be the president to make a recess appointment. So it's not like over the holidays he can make these appointments. He actually has to be the president. And I don't think in the end Republicans or Democrats in the Senate are just going to walk away from their constitutional responsibilities. This is the kind of chaos that we talked about. Frankly, my view is bring it on. We might as well try to get this through our system as fast as possible and get on with a little more serious governing.
Al, a little bit of Trump game playing here?
I have no idea what's going on in his mind except he wants to be a dictator and he wants to get retribution. Craig talked about the recess appointments. It's really important because they're temporary appointments. They're appointments when the Congress is in recess for more than 10 days. And so to do it at the beginning of a session, the Congress would have to make a affirmative decision to adjourn. And that is a problem. I do think we now know what Trump meant when he said he wanted to be a dictator on day one. when he said his administration was going to be about retribution against his political adversaries, and he called those adversaries the enemy within. I mean, it's Gates is one problem, but in the last 2 days he's announced Pete Hegseth, who's a Fox commentator as Secretary of Defense, who was one of 12 out of 2,500 National Guardsmen who was relieved of duty on January 6th after a vetting by the FBI because they thought they didn't, there's no, this was not proved, but there were signs that these 12 may have had ties in one way or another to some of the terrorist groups that were, or the groups that were leading the insurrection. Then he appoints Tulsi Gabbard, the former Democratic congressman, as director of national intelligence. A lot of people thought when she ran in 2020, she was Putin's candidate. When she ran in the Democratic primaries in 2020, she has been an apologist for Putin, blames the U.S. and the UN for the Ukraine, or U.S. and NATO for the Ukraine war, and has been playing patsy with President Assad of Syria. And then he goes to Gates for Attorney General. Craig described what's going to happen. The Ethics Committee was going to have a report tomorrow that probably would have got him all sorts of reprimands. And let's not forget, he was the guy who led the 8 members who were responsible for deposing Kevin McCarthy. I doubt if he has very many friends on the Republican side either. Look, the fact is none of these candidates would pass vetting in a normal transition. What happened with Gates, Craig, was that he, when Trump came up here yesterday to meet with Biden, Gates flew back to Florida with him, and they decided on this while Susie Wiles was completely unaware in the next room on Air Force One. So what is, there's a great piece in the Atlantic, but what links all these people is their desire to get retribution against the people who they think are their political adversaries. We now have a new majority leader who was not Trump's choice, incidentally, John Thune. I've met John Thune, ironically, on a presidential trip with Bill Clinton where he joined us. But this is a test for him, but it's a real test, I think, of one of the fundamental elements of our democracy, which is what Craig alluded to, which is, you call it separation of powers, checks and balances, but it's the constitutional responsibility of the United States Senate to advise and consent, and that is consent on appointments by the president. That is, to me, the single most important prerogative the United States Senate has in our democracy. I worked 10 years in the Senate, including a stint working for Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, on his committee when he was, as people know who are old enough, he was the greatest constitutionalist in the Senate. And I cannot believe that any senator I worked with, Republican or Democrat, would have given up a prerogative of the Senate to the executive branch. And I'll give you an example. President Nixon, in the early 1970s, before he was impeached, impounded funds that were appropriated by Congress. We had such an uproar on the Government Operations Committee, which Ervin chaired, from both Republicans and Democrats, including Bill Brock, who all of we know, the late Bill Brock, my friend from who lived in Annapolis, and that we passed specific legislation to bar him from doing that, because we thought that would change the entire relationship in our democracy between the Senate and the president. So I just want to, I'll quit now, but with under ordinary circumstances, none of these 3 people would be confirmed. the committees would ask for the FBI investigation. It'd come back. They'd never even get to hearings. But of course, nothing that Trump does is ordinary. And last weekend, as Craig alluded, he asked all three candidates for majority leader to agree to abdicate the responsibility of confirmation and rig some sort of a system where he could go to these recess appointments, which will not be approved by the Senate. Now, what the Senate does, I think, is going to tell us a lot about the future of our democracy, because it would be a bad thing, bad for the country if they went ahead and confirmed these. But at least if they went through the confirmation process and they had to vote for it, they'd be on the record. We could take that to the people in 2024, and the people could decide. But if they bypass that system and do what Trump has asked, and they go into an adjournment for more than 10 days, so he can make these appointments on his own without any vetting in Congress or any confirmation process, that very well could be the end of our democracy. Everybody knows for 2 years I've said he is a threat. Trump is an existential threat to democracy. I still believe that's true. And what that means is the two other branches of government, the Supreme Court and the Senate and the Congress, have to stand up for our constitutional republic. That's what the founders intended. That's why they separated the powers of the various branches of government. The Supreme Court has already shown that it's going to fall short. I mean, in its immunity decision, basically said the president can do whatever he wants, and as long as he does it as an official responsibility. I would just say this: if the Senate abdicates its responsibility on to confirm presidential appointments, the greatest fears of our founding fathers would have been realized, and the future of this great democratic experiment in the history of the world, the greatest democratic experiment in the history of the world, would be in grave jeopardy.
Craig, I'd like to switch gears and move to another existential threat that probably hits a little close to home here, and that is the future of talking heads on television. We see MSNBC looking at cutting back. We're seeing, I think, Morning Joe has lost almost 40% of its viewers. And talking to friends of mine, I think there's a consensus, especially those who voted for Harris, that it's their circus now. There's not much we need to focus on. It is a kind of an interesting moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it is indeed. And there was so much, I guess, anticipation, maybe angst about the election that in some ways there was a lot more attention paid perhaps than usual. It is noteworthy, though, that so many people are getting their news and information from sources other than the major media. I've seen the number as low as 30%. We've seen figures about how those who watch the news voted for Harris, those who don't pay attention to the national news voted for Trump. I thought one of the more interesting comments made in the last few days was that old line about, you have to fish, you have to go fishing where the fish are, and it was by a leader of a major news organization, and the point being that these news organizations have to figure out how to do a better job reaching people, and to some extent, for us, it may be good news, because to some extent, there's more and more emphasis on people locally who are trusted. I know we've seen our numbers grow. I don't know what will happen in the weeks ahead, but my guess is that people want to go more local, and these large, big media organizations have just grown so large. To some extent, their people appear a bit self-important, but they're just not trusted the way they once were, and so I think we're going to see a change. The one thing though about this, and it's true of both the questions you've asked, is that I think the reactions may be getting a little out ahead of what reality is going to hand us. Jim Vanderhei at Axios, he's founder of Politico and then left there and founded Axios, is really a very solid journalist. And he talks about the importance of journalism in on a recent podcast, actually. And one of the points he made is that it's every bit as important as it always was, and the work of trusted journalists does drive the conversation, even if that conversation takes place in podcasts and outside of the national news media. It's still an important driver, and I think it will remain so. And I hope I know I don't look at stories without paying attention now more than I ever did to who's the source. What's the source of this information? We've talked about, there was a story that 15 million voters didn't show up to vote. Well, it turns out that actually there's a better explanation for all of that, and as more votes are being counted, that number appears not to be accurate. But the story zoomed across the internet. I think lest we scare people even more, I think one path that Al described on these presidential appointments is a possibility. I think the more likely path, in my view, is that Matt Gaetz will have so much unloaded on his life and times that he'll take himself out. He's not confirmable. And when you see Lindsey Graham, who, by the way, says he wasn't consulted on this, which is kind of crazy since he has to oversee the confirmation process as the leader of the Senate Judiciary Committee, it is a process. And these senators are smart and savvy, and they're going to keep their powder dry, some of them, and just let some of these folks, as the Washington saying goes, twist in the wind, and perhaps the problem will go away. So that's another path, and time will tell whether that's the correct one. But I do think the way the new administration is behaving so far is going to drive a media frenzy of some kind, and I think there's going to be a continued important role for serious journalists, whether they're listened to as much as they used to be or just involved in driving the stories. I still think that role is important.
Al, do you think people are tuning out? Is that temporary? You have the last word.
I don't think I think people are tuning out of mainstream media, and I think it's a big problem. I'm on the board of the journalism school, Northwestern, and we had a meeting yesterday. And this was the subject. I mean, the talking heads are getting to be ridiculous. Sometimes when you have so much time, you provide less information. This 24-hour cable stuff, I watch more of it than I should. But the reality is that half of the people that I see is the strategists for my side, I won't even speak of his, are people that we would never even have let in the door. Yeah. I mean, they know nothing about nothing. Yeah. They would have no idea how to win a national election. The fact is that people aren't watching. Pew Research Center a week ago Saturday, how people got their election news. 13% got it from Fox, 10% got it from CNN, and they were about the same in 2021. It was maybe a little bit more biased towards CNN in 2021. But then after that, 13 and 10, 6% on local TV, 5% on ABC, which was the top network, and none of the other networks, NBC, NPR, MSNBC, the New York Times, none of them were over 3% of the people. This is symptomatic of what's happening through our society, because we talked last week, I think, briefly about the turnout in the election. And I mentioned that, the Democrats had this vaunted turnout operation, and nobody turned out. We knocked on all these doors, and the turnout was lower. On the other hand, the Republicans had an enormous turnout. And how did they do it? They used all these social media networks that I've never heard of. The reality is there are ways to deliver news that those of us who are at our age don't even know about, but are being incredibly effective in getting news to people. And so we're going to have to adapt to that. I'll just tell you one thing. Craig and I just started our new website, fromandfullers.substack.com. And when somebody signs up, we get a notice, that somebody signed up. Well, my wife signed up, and in that notice, it said, I didn't make her. I just want in that notice, it said Ginger Fromm. It gave her age and her dress size. I guess it means that the particular algorithm that goes to our website was one where she had put in information to some store where she's bought stuff. But I mean, it's just an incredible deal.
Yeah.
And if we got to get a hold of all that, because Lord knows what kind of information. I mean, we started out with this 15 million vote rumor. That's almost harmless compared to the stuff that goes on all the time. So anyway, traditional news is in real trouble. I know we're at Northwestern Journalism School, which is one of the best journalism schools in the world. We are focused like a laser on trying to figure out how to do something about it, but it is a big problem.
Hey, Dave, can I take just 30 seconds and just say one of the things to watch, that list that Al read off of how many people are watching the media is going to translate into a decision that this White House will make about around 45 chairs that sit in the White House press room, which are traditionally filled by news organizations that have been at this process for a long time. Some people don't know that the press actually does have space in the West Wing of the White House. They're already talking about, if only 30% of the people are watching these major news organizations, maybe we should put some different people in those chairs. And if you think there's going to be a fight in the Senate, watch what the media does when they start taking away their places in the White House press room.
Hey, listen, we have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.